Hello, I'm Nathalie Pettorelli. I am a scientist here at the Zoological Society of London, and I put together this event, which is called Aligning the Nature and the Climate Agenda. I've put together a short presentation to explain you how this came about and what we're trying to do. So it is no surprise, our world is changing. Our climate is changing, our sea level, our extreme event probability. We've seen this last week with the heat waves. We also have on our hand a biodiversity loss crisis with a huge loss of biodiversity in the past 50 years, as well as a land degradation crisis and a pollution crisis. And to date, our approach to dealing with those various environmental crises has been to think one problem, one solution. So we have come up with a bunch of different conventions to tackle those environmental crises. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity to address biodiversity loss, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD, to address land degradation, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then we have a convention on air pollution, on wetlands, on migratory species, on trading, basically a lot of multilateral agreement to tackle with the various problems that we are facing on the environmental front. The problem is, those crises are not separate, they are linked. So one linkages that I talk a lot about is the linkages between climate change and biodiversity loss. Basically, climate change is a driver of biodiversity loss. Everybody remember the polar bear and the ice cubes, but that goes beyond that. Climate change poses a threat from the point of view of thermal tolerance, of habitat distribution, which leads to reorganization of biodiversity. But the problem is that this impact of climate change on biodiversity has an impact on the climate change crisis itself. This is because when you're altering a species and ecosystem functioning, you're altering the Earth's capacity to stock carbon, but you're also altering the Earth's, the environment's capacity to help us adapt to the new climatic normal. And this goes beyond the climate and the biodiversity crisis, because we also have interaction between land degradation and climate change, for example. That's because soil is the largest terrestrial carbon sink. So if you degrade soil, you release a lot of greenhouse gas. If you release a lot of greenhouse gas, you accelerate climate change. Meanwhile, if you have a change in climatic condition, you exacerbate land degradation. And this is because extreme events such as drought can directly kill microbes and fungi, which help retain carbon, while heavy precipitation can increase soil erosion and flooding, so making the impact of extreme event worse. Same with pollution. You have an interaction between the pollution and the biodiversity loss crisis through, for example, either toxicity, exposure to pesticide, eutrophication, plastic pollution, but also biodiversity and land degradation, worsening pollution. That's because you're basically removing those natural capacity to reduce pollution through, for example, filtration. So when you have interacting crises, you have feedback loop, which means that things make each other worse. And the question is, of course, if you're in such a situation, do we really have the right structure to deal with all those linkages that ultimately create a crisis of the nature climate system? And this is really what motivated the writing of this report, which was published last week, which brought together nearly 20 scientists from all over the world, and who discussed the risk of having those silo, those fragmentation within the environmental policy landscape. So following the publication of that report, and here's the QR code where you can access it, we decided to put together this event, which brings together 3 speakers who will then provide an overview of that report, tell you what it is about, and highlight the issue that we're having with the current system. They will then discuss the key point from a terrestrial, but also from a marine perspective, and also from a negotiation perspective. That is where we are at, where are we going to. And then hopefully they will open up the floor for you to ask any question, but also to open a discussion on how to move forward, given what's coming. And what's coming this year is there's the intersessional session of the UNFCCC that just started this week. We have 3 conference of the parties of the 3 Rio conventions, so that's the UNCCD, the UNFCCC, and the CBD, all happening this year. And also we are having the BBNG, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, that is coming into force and with a lot of development there. And then also start discussing how those key points, the report focused a lot on international and global scale, how they mesh up with the domestic situation as of how do we bring those lessons also into a national context. So the first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Hollie, Dr. Hollie Folkard-Tapp. She is a postdoctoral research assistant at the Institute of Zoology at ZSL, where her research focuses on the policy implementation and guidelines around biodiversity and climate action, particularly in the context of the Rio Convention. Her work explores how climate solution can support both nature and society, finding practical ways to balance the need of people, biodiversity, and the planet. Her PhD in tropical forest ecology explored how to optimize the recovery of locked forest in Malaysia and Borneo, with a special focus on accurately measuring root biomass and predicting future forest regeneration. Hollie.
Hi. As the first of today's speakers, I'll be providing an overview of the new report and the key messages that it contains. And what those messages really boil down to is quite simple. It's that climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation are not separate problems. As Nathalie said, they are interconnected manifestations of a single nature-climate system, and because of this, they cannot be tackled in isolation. Our report opens with some striking statistics. Between 2023 and 2025, the average global temperatures temporarily exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. At the same time, around 1.7 billion people lived in areas where crop yields were affected by human-induced land degradation. Biodiversity is also declining at an alarming rate, with monitored wildlife populations having fallen by an average of 73% since 1970. These crises are linked through shared drivers such as unsustainable land use, overexploitation of natural resources, economic pressures, and governance failures. They also reinforce one another. Climate change accelerates biodiversity loss, while biodiversity loss reduces ecosystem resilience and carbon storage capacity, ultimately making climate change worse. Land degradation undermines both biodiversity and climate regulation. The report argues that treating these issues as separate policy challenges obscures the reality that they are part of one interconnected system. And if we continue to address them individually, we risk efforts to solve one problem actually making another one worse. Instead, the challenge is learning how to manage the climate-nature system as a whole. So before we get into discussing any solutions, the report asks an important question, which is what happens when governance continues to operate in silos? Despite the growing recognition that these crises are interconnected, the government systems we have remain largely fragmented. Internationally, the responses are shaped by the 3 Rio Conventions. Georgina will go into this in more detail, but in broad strokes, each convention has its own targets, reporting systems, planning processes, finance mechanisms, and secretariats. And nationally, we see a similar pattern. In England, climate policy is driven by carbon budgets, net zero targets, and decarbonisation plans, while biodiversity policy is delivered through mechanisms such as the Environment Act and environmental improvement plans and biodiversity net gain. And because these agendas often operate through different agencies, major land use decisions such as renewable energy or woodland creation or agricultural reform are not always planned with both climate and biodiversity objectives considered simultaneously. This really matters because many of the major land use decisions needed to achieve net zero are also decisions that will determine whether or not biodiversity targets are met. The same landscapes that are being asked to deliver carbon sequestration, renewable energy generation, food production, housing, flood resilience, and nature recovery. Without integrated planning, there is a risk that the competing objectives and inefficient use of resources will lead to missed opportunities to achieve multiple outcomes from a single intervention. Fragmentation is also particularly visible within finance. Funding streams remain heavily siloed, with climate, biodiversity, and restoration often competing for resources rather than being designed together. This creates duplication, increases transaction costs, and can incentivize projects that optimize one objective while ignoring the others. With the biodiversity funding gap at an estimated $700 billion annually, we have to start doing something differently. I want to emphasize that I'm not criticizing the value of the existing environmental agendas. Recent discussions in the media around climate scenarios provide a useful example of why these efforts really do matter. Despite some confused interpretations, the latest evidence suggests that climate action has made a difference. The highest emissions futures are now considered less likely than they once were. But the lowest emissions pathways are also becoming harder to reach. So the challenge remains: how do we keep these curves, climate change and biodiversity loss, as low as possible? The real issue is that climate change and biodiversity loss aren't really separate lines on separate graphs. They're interacting outcomes of the same underlying system, and we need to tackle them as such. There have recently been some small steps forward in improving cooperation between the environmental agendas. Georgina will give this much more detail, but last year, the Belém Joint Statement on the Rio Conventions was issued by the presidencies of the 3 conventions at COP30. The statement explicitly recognized the need for synergies in implementation and called for future work on alignment. These developments demonstrate the growing political awareness that environmental governance cannot keep operating through isolated frameworks. However, the report's assessment is that although these steps represent movement in the right direction, it remains incremental rather than transformational. To encourage more rapid and substantial process in dismantling these silos, the report provides an audit of the key risks associated with the current fragmented environmental governance. We have identified 3 broad categories of risk that emerge from the siloed approaches. First category is feedbacks. These occur when progress in one area depends on success in another. For example, biodiversity loss weakens carbon storage and ecosystem resilience, making climate change harder to address. Climate change then accelerates biodiversity decline, creating a reinforcing cycle. The second category is priority reversals. These arise when a narrow focus causes important issues to be overlooked. Climate goals may dominate the policy discussions, while biodiversity concerns receive less attention because they're perceived as less urgent, even though biodiversity is critical to long-term climate resilience. The third category is trade-offs, which occur when solutions designed to address one crisis unintentionally worsen another. A policy may appear effective in one silo while creating broader environmental damage. Critically, the report emphasizes that these categories are interconnected. Feedbacks can intensify trade-offs. Trade-offs can create new priorities. All of them contribute to a system where environmental governance become increasingly fragmented and ineffective. In our audit, we found evidence of 25 examples of negative consequences driven by 17 processes. A selection of the examples that we identified in our audit are included in the report's first figure, grouped by the broader type of action. Some of these impacts are well known and frequently discussed, such as biofuel subsidies driving habitat conversion and biodiversity loss, as well as leading to competition for space for food production. Another common example concerns carbon markets and afforestation schemes. Financial incentives can encourage monoculture tree planting on already biodiversity-rich habitats such as native grasslands, leading to biodiversity loss despite the climate benefits. But we also identified many less familiar examples, including those designed to improve biodiversity, which have negative impact on climate goals. One comes from city greening initiatives. Planting trees in cities is often perceived as a biodiversity and urban cooling solution. However, some exotic species of tree emit BVOCs, which can contribute to ozone formation and worsen air quality, underscoring the importance of planting the right trees in the right places. In another example, nature-friendly farming can lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions through reducing domestic yields and necessitating increased imports to meet demand. These examples reveal that even well-intentioned environmental actions can generate harmful outcomes when designed through a single-issue lens. But what Figure 1 really aims to illustrate is not that particular climate or biodiversity interventions are inherently bad. Rather, it shows how a siloed approach can generate unintended consequences. We can achieve success against a single metric while undermining the wider nature-climate system. The figure therefore reframes the challenge. The problem is not simply choosing the right intervention, but governing environmental crises as an interconnected system rather than as separate policy agendas to avoid accidentally moving in the wrong direction. When auditing the examples of risks, we identified a range of themes into which the trade-offs were grouped. You'll notice that while many highlight the risk of climate action on biodiversity or biodiversity-boosting measures to climate outcomes, there are themes which have much more diverse institutional and governance-related impacts. Regulatory conflicts occur where legal mandates and conservation zoning stall climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, such as specific species protection mandates delaying, limiting, or totally blocking the development of wind energy infrastructure. Increased reporting costs come from misaligned reporting cycles and a lack of awareness of the similarities in reporting needs. In some cases, different teams are generating the same information to inform different processes, wasting resources that are already extremely limited. And stakeholder fatigue. Repetitive and disconnected consultation processes can erode community trust and participation. Specifically, citizens can experience consultation fatigue from being subjected to separate, overlapping elements. In these cases, what began as a solution can ultimately weaken both climate and biodiversity outcomes. These social and institutional consequences of poor integration make it even harder to then break the cycle. It can lead to policy lock-in, where investments, institutions, and incentives become organized around a particular pathway, making alternative approaches harder to adapt. The report proposes a variety of solutions for overcoming these silos. I'm going to leave the international institutional recommendations to Georgina and focus on the non-state action and the national governance. One important recommendation is to ally the Rio Convention's action agendas. These are a form of soft governance that help coordinate action by non-state and subnational actors. They're intended to raise ambition, steer implementation, and track progress towards environmental goals. However, they have largely evolved independently of one another. This matters because action agendas engage many of the actors capable of delivering change on the ground: businesses, NGOs, cities, indigenous peoples, and local communities. If these agendas remain disconnected, opportunities for integrated action are missed. I recently developed a scorecard to assess the robustness of the different action agendas, including the extent to which they collaborate with each other. The results indicate missed opportunities for non-state actors to play a major role in holistic, integrated environmental action. The report also highlights integrated spatial planning as a critical tool. Land is increasingly expected to deliver multiple objectives simultaneously: carbon sequestration, renewable energy, food production, housing, flood resilience, and biodiversity recovery, to name a few. Bringing these priorities together within a single planning framework can help identify trade-offs before they occur and reveal opportunities to generate multiple benefits from the same landscapes. Another recommendation is to integrate environmental risk into economic forecasting. The report argues that environmental change, such as climate change and biodiversity loss, should be treated as sovereign risks. Degradation of the nature-climate system affects the foundations of economic prosperity, influencing food security, water availability, infrastructure resilience, supply chains, and public health. This means that responsibility cannot solely sit with environmental departments such as DEFRA. Treasury departments and fiscal watchdogs should incorporate environmental risk and volatility into their economic forecasting and long-term planning. The recent UK government report showing that biodiversity loss is a national security risk reflects the growing recognition that environmental degradation is not just a conservation issue, but a systemic threat to economic and societal resilience. And finally, the report argues for prioritising funding for projects that generate multiple benefits. Climate finance, biodiversity finance, and land restoration finance are still largely siloed, and that's not even getting into the marine side of things. Instead, investment should be directed towards integrated interventions that deliver positive outcomes across all three agendas simultaneously, helping maximise impact while making more efficient use of limited resources. The final point I want to emphasise is that integration must go beyond place-based approaches. Much of the recent discussion around delivering benefits for climate, nature and people has centred around nature-based solutions. These are becoming prominent within the Rio Conventions and feature increasingly in nationally determined contributions. When implemented according to best practice, nature-based solutions can deliver vital benefits for both climate and biodiversity. However, their contribution to climate mitigation is often overstated, and there is a risk of relying on them as a primary mechanism for achieving climate-nature synergies. Their potential is inherently constrained because they depend on ecosystems that are themselves under growing pressure from climate change, biodiversity loss, and competing demands for land and resources. More fundamentally, they don't necessarily address the systems that drive the environmental degradation in the first place. A key part of my work at IOZ has been starting to develop the concept of integrated nature-climate action, to draw attention to the range of actions vital for consideration in a joint nature-climate agenda. This figure shows examples mapped against key sectors within the UK's nationally determined contribution. The message is that every sector has opportunities to contribute to both climate and nature objectives simultaneously. Realising this vision requires a whole-of-society approach increasingly recognised across the Rio Conventions, with governments, businesses, cities, civil society organisations and communities all playing a role. Crucially, integrated nature-climate action cannot assume that co-benefits will emerge automatically. It requires explicit consideration of trade-offs, distributional impacts, justice, and long-term system resilience. The objective is to design interventions that strengthen the nature-climate system as a whole. Ultimately, integrated nature-climate action requires a shift from managing symptoms to addressing the underlying drivers. If the polycrisis is systemic, then our response must be systemic too. That is the level of integration required if we are serious about tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation together, and successfully. Before I hand over to the next speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the support of ZSL and the other institutional partners in the publication of this report. The work was made possible through the Biocam4 Research Consortium and funded through international research partnerships involving Canada, Germany, and the UK government. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our panel discussion.
I'll leave Hollie go back to her seat, and I'll introduce the next speaker. So we are moving to the seas, and let me introduce Dr. Mark Dickey-Collas. So here it is. Mark is an independent marine scientist with over 30 years of experience advising science-informed policy. His work focuses on linking fisheries management and nature conservation through ecosystem-based management. He advised implementation of international agreements, including the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Common Fishery Policy, and the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, BBNG. As former chair of the ICES Advisory Committee, Mark led the delivery of scientific advice to governments across the North Atlantic and Arctic. He currently chairs the IUCN Fishery Expert Group, is an adjunct professor at the Danish Technical University, and chairs the International Science Board of the Netherlands Regeneration of the North Sea Programme. Mark.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to be here and be invited. I joined the report quite late on, so I made a minor contribution, so I feel a bit of a fraud being here, but there we are. So I'm going to be talking to you about 3 C's and 1 warning. Now, we've been talking about interconnectedness, and it's kind of cheeky of me to say we're going to talk about interconnectedness by going into 3 different examples. But I hope you see that I can manage to merge those all together and bring it all forward into one coherent story. Who am I? Nathalie already gave you the background of who I am, and I'm a fisheries scientist, and I've been drawn into ecosystem-based management and ecosystem-based fisheries management. And since I've become independent, I'm particularly focusing on a lot of the biodiversity agenda and how that relates to fisheries and how fisheries relate back to the biodiversity agenda. I used to be the world expert on herring. I'm very proud of claiming that title. And people asked me afterwards, well, who's the current world expert on herring? Unfortunately, there wasn't one after me, so there we go. So here we are. Why do the seas and oceans matter? I think it's fairly evident that particularly on an island nation like the United Kingdom, that the oceans and the seas matter. Oceans are central to the climate system, we know that. Marine ecosystems support nature and people, and I'm passionate in my work on biodiversity to recognize that people are the agents of change and they're the agents of increased pressure as well. And you need to bring people into the biodiversity forum to make real active change. Climate change is already reshaping ocean life. You're going to see quite a lot of examples of that from me now. And ocean governance is unusually fragmented. I mean, we specialize, and every area of the world's oceans and seas claims it's unique because it's complicated and fragmented. So, my 3 C's. I'm going to talk about the Mediterranean Sea. I'm going to give an example from the North Sea, and I'm going to give an example from the Central Arctic Ocean. They're very different seas. One is embayed, one is semi-enclosed, and one is very open. The Arctic Ocean, as we know it, has been around for 47 million years. The Mediterranean, as we know it, for about 5 million years, and it's kind of come and gone. And the North Sea, as we know it, for only 10,000 years. That's quite important to realize. I was once asked by a student what happened to the herring populations in the North Sea 10,000 years ago. And my response was, well, if they were there, they were dead, because it was dry. The southern North Sea, that is. And 2 of these seas are heavily impacted by human activities, extremely impacted. So, I'm now going to take you south. Let's go on holiday to the Mediterranean. And I'm going to talk to you about a non-indigenous species, the blue crab. I'm not going to say the Latin name because I'll muck it up, but you can read it up there, those of you that have studied Latin. And I think what this does, as an example, I want you to take home, is it shows that governance needs to adapt. When you start talking about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and other crises as well, particularly in the Mediterranean, because we have great political unrest in the Mediterranean as well, governance needs to adapt if it is to work and move forward. So, blue crab is an invasive species. There are 2 species. One came through the Suez Canal about, and I've got the figures here, 1898, and one arrived in the northern Mediterranean in 1949 from North America in shipping, in ballast water. So already we've got some issues. We've got transport coming in, causing invasive species. Transport is managed independently and separately. Invasive species is managed through the biodiversity agenda. So there we have a schism already. However, both of those have been around, as I said, 1898 and 1949 have been around for quite a long time in the Mediterranean. But about 20 years ago, blue crab began taking off. People couldn't work out what was going on. Unsurprisingly, by about 2010, they realized the Mediterranean is getting warmer, blue crab was being more successful. Blue crab is fine, it's all well and good, except blue crab doesn't have a predator in the Mediterranean Sea. It also is very destructive. It also likes the lagoons and the areas where the rivers come in. It also destroys fishing gear and also eats lots of other things. So we have an example in a lagoon close to Marseille where only 4 or 5 years ago there were 2 blue crabs caught per year by the fishing industry. And in 2024 there was 20 to 50 kilos per day landed out of that lagoon. And the economic consequences were huge because we have Manila clam fisheries and aquaculture production absolutely collapsed by 90% in that lagoon and along the Po Delta as a whole. So climate change, biodiversity, and maritime industries all came together and impacted also with aquaculture. So the risks are, in terms of the report, that what we're seeing is maladaptive environmental management. We're also missing the co-benefits. What we really don't have is the governance capability to deal with blue crab in the way we would like to. I'm now going to pull that back a little bit in the next bit that I say, but also we have a failure to integrate cross-cutting approaches. Having said all that and said we don't have the ability, there is one organisation in the Mediterranean which is doing its utmost, and that's the General Fisheries Commission of the Mediterranean, GFCM, and they are working very hard to come up with integrated approaches. Now, they're a fisheries organisation, and yet they are lucky because they also are responsible for aquaculture, so they're beginning to come together with the environmentalists and are beginning to look at ways to find research that can address the issues around blue crab. Okay, my next example. Much closer to home. Those of you who know me will know that I worked in the Netherlands for 10 years, working mostly in the North Sea. And in the North Sea, we are seeing a quite spectacular, rapid rise in renewable energies, and everybody's going, yay, wonderful. And in fact, some of the policies that are being put into place right now, such as the European Union's Nature Restoration Regulation, says that we need to think about restoration, we need to make sure that biodiversity is increased by improving our benthic habitat, that's a habitat on the seabeds, except when it comes to defence and renewables. We don't have to have the same rigour because we need the renewables. So currently 1% of the North Sea is full of wind farms. The projection is that by 2050, 11% of the North Sea will be covered by wind farms. That's 3 times the size of Wales, and actually just over the size of Croatia, if you know the size of Croatia. So we have this situation where everybody's saying, great, wonderful, we're trying to solve the problem we have with climate change, we have a mitigation measure, let's build the wind farm. Unfortunately, wind farms change habitat, that goes without saying, so you're largely turning soft sediment into hard substrate. They disrupt the migration routes of organisms, that's all sharks, birds, and cetaceans. It displaces sensitive species from certain habitats, and something which has got almost no publicity at all is that it's changing the water stability. So the water is becoming more stable, and the North Sea is quite spectacular. We're in the British Isles, we're lucky, we have huge tides, we have a lot of storms, we have what's called in my oceanographic world a very mixed water column. That is going to change once you start putting poles across 11% of the North Sea. That will affect the productivity of the plankton, it will change the habitats, and all of this intensifies the conflicts with existing users, so that includes maritime industries and of course includes fisheries. And a lot of the wind farm companies are a little surprised when you say, well, have you spoken to the fishermen about this? They say, well, no, because it's good, because they attract fish. Well, they do, but fishermen are also banned from fishing near the wind parks. So we have unintended consequences from this example. We have regulatory conflict, and we've got to be very careful. We need innovation to be taken in an integrated manner, not to tackle one crisis by worsening others, such as biodiversity. And we need to adopt integrated spatial planning. Did you know that we don't even have, every country around the North Sea has a different approach to their environmental impact assessment for wind farms, and we don't even have a database altogether for all of the information. Every company that does an environmental impact assessment for a wind farm leaves it in their own database. And so we have no way of putting it all together. My next example is Central Arctic Ocean. We get a sexy polar bear up there. We have rapid ecosystem change, little active management, and what we really need is anticipatory governance. And we need guardrails before exploitation. And we know that the summer sea ice has fallen by the extent of it has fallen by 24% from 2020 to 2025. So that's a loss and a huge change up there. Uncertainty, however, is very high. We have to be very careful. Uncertainty should shape the guardrails, but it shouldn't be an excuse for not delaying action. What we're struggling with in the Arctic is we know so little, everybody assumes nothing matters, nothing's happening. And there are a number of bodies which are coming together, such as the Arctic Council, such as the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, of which I used to be a prominent employee, and such as the Central Arctic Fish Stocks Agreement, is coming together to try and build something that is an integrated management up there. But the information is very, very poor. And so we've got to take data-limited approaches. That means precaution needs to be very, very high. The ecosystem remains remote, poorly observed, and incompletely understood. And we have limited evidence, and that is often interpreted as limited risk. So by looking at this, we need to think about and make sure that we don't underestimate the risks associated with human activities in the Arctic as it experiences climate change. And we need to think about the reduced scientific understanding in terms of our predictive capabilities when activities happen there. And as has been said already, if you take a siloed approach or a sectoral approach, you really are beginning to get into a sticky situation. So those are my three examples. The Mediterranean Sea, I want you to think about the static mandates. We have a large change going on up there. Another fact I didn't give to you is that 80% of the catches in the small-scale fisheries around Cyprus are now invasive species. 80%. And if we have static governance up there, down there, up and down, south of here, we will miss change. And we will also start having more social unrest than we have already because we will struggle with the social and economic consequences of not addressing that change in the ecosystem. With the North Sea, we have very clearly separate decisions. For each of the activities in the North Sea, despite having a European Union, we still have DG Environment, we still have DG Maritime, and I call it DG Mara. We have the UK, we have Norway, we have the Faroes up in the north, all of those with their own siloed governances internally and siloed governance out externally. And then we have the Central Arctic Ocean with fragmented evidence. And we've got to be very careful that that isn't seen as a reason to delay our precaution and delay advice and integration. So the opportunity is now, and the challenge is connecting the implementation. The evidence is available. We're very lucky in the Northeast Atlantic. We have a large number of status assessments. OSPAR, that's the Regional Sea Convention in the Northeast Atlantic, has a quality status report every, I think it's 6 years or so. We have just had yesterday the delivery of the World Ocean Assessment, the third one, so the evidence is there. We have the goals and targets through the Global Biodiversity Framework, and I'm very pleased that when I went independent, I was taken under the wing of the marine side of the Global Biodiversity, of CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, and they are great champions for the 23 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. 30 by 30 is only one of 23 targets. So when the BBC, and I'm going to say this, I hate the way the BBC does its biodiversity and environmental reporting, but when they say that the BBNJ, which I'm going to get to, and the Global Biodiversity Framework is about 30 by 30, it's not. It's about very clear goals and targets across a way to integrate and bring together our actions to deal with the biodiversity crisis. And we have the international cooperation on the BBNJ agreement, and that means biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, the international waters, where we will think about area-based management tools, we will think about capacity building, we will think about genetic resources, and we will think about environmental impacts assessments integrating across all of the sectors in the international waters. So, the sea experiences combined effects. Siloed governance cannot manage them. There are attempts to bring this all together. CBD, that's the Convention on Biological Diversity, along with FAO, that's the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and UNEP with the Regional Seas Conventions, are working on the Sustainable Ocean Initiative, which brings together people from different sectors, and we all meet every 2 years and talk about how we should and respond to the lack of integration and how we should bring about more integration. And in the Northeast Atlantic, the Regional Sea Convention, OSPAR, which looks after the environmental side, and the Fisheries Organization, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, NEAF, they get together every year and they invite everybody together under what they call the collective arrangement. And there they also had the mining side with ISA, the maritime side with IMO, the Doualos, which is the law of the sea in the United Nations. And interestingly, now, increasingly coming to our meetings, is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, who are playing a bigger role as we talk about compliance and making sure that the measures that are agreed are implemented. So I think that's me, and if anybody wants my talk, I've got tons more reading there for you.
So if you have a question for Mark, keep it ready for our panel session, because we're just going to move to our last speaker. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Georgina Chandler, who is the head of policy and campaign here at ZSL, where she began to work in 2023 after 7 years at RSPB. Georgina's work aimed to elevate the work of ZSL and to influence the issue that matter most, allowing people and wildlife to thrive together. Georgina engages in the UK policy-making process in a range of ways, from the provision of evidence that can aid in science-led policymaking to connecting with parliamentarian and government departments. Her work also shapes global policy by engaging with UN convention and negotiation. Georgina.
Hello, everyone. As Nathalie said, my name is Georgina. I'm Head of Policy and Campaigns here at ZSL. I'm very disappointed that our ocean presentation didn't have one joke about red herrings in it. Are you saving those for the panel discussion? Because otherwise I'm going to have to... I was trying to think if I could incorporate it into my talk, and I fell short, actually. So I'll see if I can get it in the panel discussion as well. So I've been working on the international conventions since 2016. So I've been to quite a few of the international agreements and international meetings. I'm going to try and convince you that there are solutions that still exist at the international level with the conventions, what they might be, what might stand in their way of progress, and what the opportunity is this year as well. So before we begin, I hope I don't have to convince you that policy is important. Do I? Anyone not convinced? I mean, feel free to say no. It definitely impacts the whole operating environment that we work in. It can either smooth the way to change that we want to see, or it can be a barrier causing negative impacts for nature, climate, and people. You've probably heard lots of people say we're facing geopolitical headwinds at the moment, and that's quite a trendy thing to say. But it is true, and that can make global cooperation feel under strain. The reality is that we need it now more than ever before. But we also need to be honest about what the global processes can and can't deliver. They're not going to be a silver bullet for everything. I think a lot of people hang their hope on them and think that every single COP that happens every year is going to solve climate change. They're part of a bigger puzzle of action. But while imperfect, I like to say that if they didn't exist, I'd probably spend my whole career advocating for them to exist. So at least it saves me a job from that perspective. And they can help us do 4 things really, really well. They can set the direction of travel, so saliency and narrative is really important. So for example, around net zero. They can help us agree shared goals and targets. So we've mentioned the 30 by 30 target for protected areas. That's quite a famous one, but there's also the 1.5 degree target and other ones in other conventions. They can help us coordinate responses across countries and regions. And they ultimately also help us track progress in a consistent way and hopefully create some kind of accountability process as well. We've already heard that the nature and climate crisis are inherently interlinked. So the question for today is not whether nature and climate are connected. We know they are. The real question is whether our institutions and our politics are set up to reflect and respond to that effectively. And that matters, especially this year, because all 3 Rio conventions are meeting, and that gives us a real opportunity to get this architecture right. So the 3 Rio conventions came out of the 1992 Earth Summit, and they were always meant to work together. Climate depends on healthy ecosystems, biodiversity loss makes climate change worse, and land degradation drives both. But in practice, they've spent more than 30 years operating largely and practically in isolation from each other. They have separate secretariats, as we've heard, separate reporting cycles, separate COPs, and often separate ministries and budgets at the national level too. And the result is predictable. Policies are often disconnected, sometimes inconsistent, and often working against each other as well. So why is 2026 such an important opportunity? It's a triple COP year, as I've mentioned, which creates a rare opening for the conventions to signal in the same direction. A little bit like ships in the night, maybe. We're just trying to get as many marine jokes in as possible. There's already growing momentum in negotiations and political attention around this issue that we can build from. And there's joined up action becoming more mainstream across the UN systems, and we're hearing more about synergies in the dialogues across these conventions as well. So you can see this very snazzy diagram. I will credit my colleague, Bethan Laughlin, for creating this illustration. She spent quite a bit of time giving this thought, so I won't take credit for it. But it helps show that synergies are both at that kind of issue and topic level, but also in the way that the conventions work with each other. So when we talk about synergies, what do we actually mean? I think, put quite simply, we mean joining up action, where the mandates of the conventions overlap. A lot sits in separate spaces, but there are also significant shared middle ground in that central area as well. And right now, there's no strong system for working in that space together. In practice, that means aligning climate, biodiversity and land policies so they reinforce each other instead of operating in these silos. Done well, it should cut duplication, make implementation more effective. And we have our shared global goals and targets, and the focus we know should be on implementation now. The challenge is not redefining these crises, but actually delivering the solutions. And to do that well, our systems need to match the reality that these issues are deeply interconnected. So momentum has been building over the last 3 years. Anybody who's familiar with the international meeting scheduling knows that there's quite a lot of meetings every year, and they happen at the same time every year, and that's one of the few things you can kind of count on, actually. And we have made some progress over the last 3 years. The CBD and the UNFCCC have both taken decisions that recognise the need for stronger links across the conventions. In the climate space, the global stocktake and more recent negotiations at COP30 have also started to open the door to this conversation. I'll cover this in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the problem is we still don't have a substantive outcome. The issue is getting serious attention, but most of that has been signalling through non-state actor interventions or through kind of momentum in the sidelines, and we're still waiting for a substantive negotiated outcome. So overall, what have we seen so far? We have a clear visibility shift. It has moved the issues of synergies from the margins into the mainstream of the negotiations. So just to give you a bit of an example, June, so this time last year in Bonn, they spent about 45 minutes on the synergies agenda, and you would think, great, that's efficient, that's effective. Anyone that knows an international negotiation knows that just means they were like, yep, great, fantastic, move on. And that shifted into 5 substantive negotiations at COP30 with strong government engagement in the room. So within that space of sort of 6 months, Bonn really set the stage, and then by the time we got to COP30, there was a real interest and sort of packed rooms talking about synergies, which was a really positive signal. We've seen that real political momentum. There's now broad support from countries and civil societies for this agenda, and it's frequently a central point of discussion and a priority for incoming presidencies. So the COPs at the end of the year, we've seen the presidencies of each of those COPs signal that synergies is a priority for them, which I don't think would have happened maybe even 3 years ago. But as I've mentioned, the formal outcome is still quite limited. So the next step is turning our attention into what that concrete outcome could look like. So when discussing progress and opportunities, I'm going to quite selfishly focus on the CBD and the UNFCCC. That's not a reflection of the UNCCD in any way. That's just where my area of expertise is as well. So I'd welcome any input from the audience also when we get into the discussion about anyone who has experience in UNCCD and what they would like to see out of the COP this year as well. So COP30 was an expression of this shift, as I've mentioned, and it was a significant step forward. What was once a short, very procedural discussion now is getting multiple substantive negotiating sessions. So how do we make the most of those? It's no longer a niche issue, but political statements of intent on their own are not enough. So if synergies seem so logical, why do some countries still not want them? And I think this is something that's an interesting question to explore a little bit as well. So the first one is mandate protection. So some countries worry that joined-up action and joined-up work stretches beyond where each convention is meant to be. And largely these concerns are around perceived loopholes or where one process might allow more ambition or less ambitious action than another. The second one is accountability. Integrated planning makes contradictions harder to hide, and because climate, biodiversity and land commitments have to be considered together, that can kind of expose some of these ways of working that aren't particularly effective. Third is speed. Some argue that more coordination will slow things down, and for some that's a genuine concern. A lot of governments come to the negotiations with a very small delegation. Some of them are only 1 or 2 people, and they're very reluctant to add more agenda items to the negotiating table, more things to discuss, more things to agree. They don't have time to consider this, even if it might save them time in the long run. And finally, on finance, some parties worry that more integrated approaches could change how funding is allocated or even potentially restrict the amount of options they have for funding at a national level. If you're a developing country, there might be a disincentive to aligning climate and biodiversity finance into one because they think that's going to be taking two different options for funding, merging them into one and therefore reducing that total amount that you might have. So that's a real concern for some countries as well. So global agreements can set direction, but I think we've also heard that delivery really happens nationally. So before I go on to some of the solutions that we might want to see through those convention processes, I wanted to draw out a couple of national policy solutions from Panama and from the UK. So they're encouraging examples. Panama is actively trying to make a more integrated approach to climate, nature, land, and the ocean in their planning and reporting. A particular benefit that they see in doing this is because they hope that through integrating these processes, not only is it more efficient for national planning, reporting, and aligning, they also think it will make their pipeline of projects, especially conservation projects, more bankable for international investors, so easier to fund these kind of unified projects, and they're seeing that as a real win in doing this. In the UK published its Unlocking Benefits for People, Nature and Climate report last year, and this helps show the way it's described potential joined-up national action could look like in practice. Currently, this has mainly been helpful from a narrative perspective. It's the first time that we've seen this information presented in a joined-up way in the UK in a national policy document. So now we wait to see what that looks like in practice, and I think some of our previous speakers alluded to what those solutions might be as well. And as we know, the international system makes that national coherence slightly more difficult. Countries are still asked to submit separate plans on different timelines and to different secretariats. So often the solutions are left to the national level, and it's very much down to a country whether they decide to do these synergies rather than it being something that's integrated at the international level as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the opportunity is this year and what the solutions are that we're hoping to see specifically from COP31 and from COP17. So that's the UNFCCC Climate COP, which will be happening in November, and the CBD COP17 that will be happening in October. Obviously, there's also the UNCCD COP that's this August, which is first in Mongolia. As I said, it's a triple COP year, and it makes it a genuine window for progress. All three conventions should ideally move together, but progress under the UNFCCC is particularly important for a lot of people. I think that's primarily because the political attention and buy-in is most prominent within that process. So it's one of those where if you can make it happen there, you can kind of make it happen anywhere. The longer-term goal is ideally, and one of the potential options is a shared mechanism for cooperation across the conventions, whether that's called a joint programme of work or something else. At COP31, to help make that happen, there are a few key things that we need to see. We need to see some clear work areas for cooperation identified across the conventions, a stronger mandate for something called the Joint Liaison Group, and more capacity for that. So there are some existing processes in place that if they had a slightly stronger mandate and they had a bit more capacity to implement some of the actions that they've identified, they could make some genuine progress. A request for parties to align national strategies and action plans. So we saw some examples from Panama in doing so. So there is the option for that kind of more national alignment. And a permanent space at the COP for these discussions to continue. So that's something that's been called for quite a while, is having this dedicated space for discussion on cooperation synergies. At the moment, there's a cooperation agenda item. It kind of covers this, but there isn't a permanent space in the UNFCCC to continue these conversations. And if that doesn't exist, it's very unlikely that these other things will come from that as well. At CBD COP17, we need a similarly clear signal of support for stronger collaboration. So There are decisions that set out a clear path for stronger Rio Convention collaboration, and there's these things called technical information exchanges that have been happening over the course of the last year, where Nathalie has participated, and also my colleague Bethan has. So there's these spaces that have been created by the CBD to explore what the benefits are of enhanced collaboration, what the opportunities are, what the delivery mechanisms might be. At the moment, they're dialogues. They'll report into the COP. Again, there's not a kind of formal process that's been agreed. And there's something called the Joint Liaison Group, which is also cuts across both of those conventions. So a lot of technical terms in there as well. So ultimately, we want a dedicated space for this. Ultimately, we want national alignment, and we want the international level to send that signal. So three key things from my side to take away. Firstly, just to recognise that this fragmentation, I think we've heard this from all speakers, is structural. It's not an accidental thing. Sometimes it's quite intentional by certain governments to keep these processes separate, whether that's because of benefits or risks that are perceived. The Rio Conventions were designed to be connected. They have shared challenges and shared solutions, but in practice, they still operate too separately. The second point is that political momentum is real and growing, and the evidence of why there are benefits to joined-up action is increasingly clear. It's now firmly more mainstream in the negotiations. There's stronger recognition across countries and conventions that this is an important issue, and that is a real demonstration of change. When I started working in these spaces in 2016, there wasn't really that much conversation about joining the dots between the conventions. Every time it was mentioned in a negotiating room, somebody threw up their hands about overlapping mandates. We can't possibly consider that. Please don't talk to me about that. And I genuinely think the conversation has shifted. I know it feels like 10 years is a long time. Sometimes it does. I remember sitting in a CBD negotiation, and it was the climate change agenda item, and we spent about 6 hours debating whether we were concerned or very concerned about climate change. So when I say it's moved, I genuinely think it has. And just to underscore that I genuinely believe 2026 is a key moment and a window for opportunity. All three COPs meeting, there's a real chance to put practical mechanisms in place for joined-up action. And I think we've heard across all of the speakers today about why that would be beneficial and why potentially our policy solutions need to evolve and grow with what we need today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina. We're going to move into a panel discussion, so I'm going to ask my three speakers to take a seat.
I was wondering, I heard some people talking about not liking how the BBC reports on the environment, talking about unhelpful narratives. I was wondering what you thought about how the two issues, the polycrises, have been communicated to the public, and if that has been like a problem in what you're seeing now, and if that is also important to solve to make real progress for maybe people working in the sectors that don't have an eye on the science agendas.
I think that's a very good question. Someone wants to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start, but I'm sure everybody's got contributions they want to make as well. I think it's always easier to focus on the shared problems rather than, oh, if we do this, then this will happen. So I think it often makes a better story to pit the issues against each other, to focus on why there's problems or moments of friction. So I think kind of focusing more on what we're trying to achieve collectively and what the shared actions towards that are is a much more helpful way of framing things. But we know what the news cycle is. It doesn't always make interesting and exciting news from that perspective. And at the international level, there is reluctance potentially to join some of these processes together, ultimately because there's always a perceived benefit to having them separately. So people aren't doing it because there's a kind of philosophical reason why they believe it should be separate. It's because ultimately the system that exists at the moment benefits them. So for whatever reason that is, whether that's because it allows for a kind of lower level of ambition across the agreements in some cases. In other cases, there's a genuine concern that if you for example, the CBD process, it can be perceived as easier to get agreement in the CBD process on things. So allowing a kind of climate decision in a CBD process, it's harder to get that through in the UNFCCC. So that's perceived as a risk because there might be issues that people have been trying to not let through in the UNFCCC that trickle through in the CBD, and they're like, whoa, no, you can't. There are perceived different strengths and weaknesses across the conventions as well. And also, as I mentioned, the kind of finance point, there's this perception, which I think is real, that you end up with this kind of double counting is also an issue, but also if you joined it together, there might eventually be a smaller pot of funding for developing countries. So there's a genuine concern there about joining some of this together.
Anyone else wants to add something?
I'm happy to. When I was sat down, Nathalie went, the whole BBC? And I have to say that it's not. It's just the Today programme on Radio 4. I just, every morning, if there's something on there, what I find really frustrating is you'll have farming programme just before the Today programme, if you're up at 5:45, which has a fairly robust approach, I think, to the whole concepts of a holistic food production system where we need biodiversity to recover and also to deal with the climate change. And then 15 minutes later, we get the Today programme with a frustrating romanticization, that's a word I can't really say, of particularly the marine environment. I've heard the Today programme talk about, oh, you can put things out, put the windmills out in the sea because there's nothing there. Or we have the deserts, of course, out in the sea. And language like this, which just makes me shout and go, ugh, but I'm here to be positive. I think what's important is that there are ways to make the narrative work very well. I'm quite impressed how many people listen to very long podcasts that I've been interviewed on. And I'm, wow, you've given an hour and 15 minutes of your time to listen to that. That's quite wonderful. And on the flip side of that, I've just spent the last few weeks working with the fishing industry, who are getting very frustrated that they're being painted in a way that doesn't recognize their attempts to improve their practices in terms of biodiversity crisis. And so it's that recognition that needs to be a narrative in that. So there we are. That's my rambling. Sorry.
I think your problem is you're getting up too early. So yeah, I can add a bit more on the sort of narrative and priorities side of things. There is this sort of general recent consensus that climate change seems a lot more urgent than the biodiversity crisis, and part of that is because historically biodiversity loss has been focused on single species stories, like we're losing the polar bear, or tigers are endangered, or the WWF panda. Whereas climate change, it's very easy to say carbon or greenhouse gases. Part of that is reflected in the actual complexity of managing the crises. Biodiversity indicators are hugely wide-ranging and difficult to summarize and keep track of, whereas with climate change, we have the CO2 equivalent. So even though there are different greenhouse gases, it all gets converted into CO2 equivalent, which is easy to talk about. And I guess back to journalism, I had a quote from a former journalist who said that the biodiversity crisis has a PR problem, and part of that is because the word biodiversity is not so headline friendly as climate change. Or like talking about biodiversity is my job and I still fluffed the word about 3 times in my presentation. Like it's not as headlineable. And I think the way that people are trying to get around this is, we talk about the nature crisis when we really mean the biodiversity crisis, but whether that strengthens the narrative or just muddies the waters further is a bit of a red herring. That's up to you to decide.
I mean, just to add on this one to finish off, and then I'll go straight to you. I think that silo is ultimately an outcome of simplification. We do like simple stories. which is why we ended up in silos and into fragmentation. We're not good at thinking about complexity. I tend to work on ecosystem, which is, to me, the most fascinating thing, but has never taken into conservation, mostly because people think that it's too complex, not very understandable, and do not like system thinking. And I see the parallel with governance, is that what we're talking about is a system where we have multiple levers, things that interact, things that can move in one way or another. And instead of wanting to apprehend and manage and think about that system, we're trying to simplify it into very small things and completely remove the interaction with the rest, and that's where we're going wrong. You had a question, I think.
Thank you so much for the talk, really interesting. So I work in sustainable finance, and one thing I find quite interesting about the presentations that you've all given is that a lot of the focus on the silos has been on the actual processes of those COPs or of those UN summits. We project manage every year our presence at UNFCCC COP, and my observation on that is that what's interesting from a de-silo perspective is that it's the one opportunity of the year to work really, really closely with science in terms of the one place where science, policy, private sector, public sector are all meeting. And I think throughout the COP processes, I wanted to get your steer as to how you think we can collaborate more across those stakeholder types, because I've sat in a lot of the negotiations, and I think to get public sector or private sector in that space is a completely different conversation. I mean, the language of the UN is not the same as the language of the private sector or the scientific kind of experts. So I think there needs to be a language shift, but I think most of the progress that happens at COP, in my view, I've done 10 years of COPs now, UNFCCC, just to clarify, is that the progress is on the sidelines where those 4 types of stakeholders, and 5 civil society, are meeting. And I think we need more focus on the ways of interacting with each other than just the conventions themselves. And I wanted to, get your thoughts on that.
Who wants to take this?
Yeah.
All of you?
Yeah, without kicking off everyone. No, completely agree, 100%. And I think it speaks a bit to what Hollie was talking about around the action agendas as well, and how we can capitalise on and use all of that surround sound momentum that, as you say, reinforces itself across science, across policy, across business to help drive action in those different areas, and also to reinforce each other. Business is an incredibly important signaller for policymakers as well. There's lots of concentric cycles around, like, okay, the UNFCCC can set the targets and the agenda, but ultimately there's an accountability process and an implementation process that sits with business as well. And if the narrative isn't aligned across those different areas, then they can mutually positively reinforce each other, and they can also mutually negatively reinforce each other as well. So I think it's incredibly important. I think we can do more to celebrate and to amplify that benefit of those processes as well. And I think it's something that the CBD in particular has lagged behind on. I think the UNFCCC, as you say, has had this robustness around its action agenda and around those sideline processes for a lot longer, which is why something like the political buy-in and something like the TFFF that came out of COP30 could happen in the margins of COP30, was because of this political will, investor conversation that was happening at the same time. The CBD, I was reflecting earlier with colleagues, when I first started in that process, the action agenda was maybe like 3 stands outside a conference kind of centre that looked like this, and it would be the GEF, it would be UNDP, and it'd be IUCN. And those are like the 3 stands that you would have. You wouldn't have that kind of action. And then reflecting on it from COP16, and just the kind of volume of interest that has grown in the last decade, the number of businesses that are now attending, the number of science conversations that are happening, panel discussions, commitments on the margins, the momentum has genuinely really grown. And I think people can be quite cynical about it. I don't think it's all empty promises. I think there's a genuine kind of momentum growing behind it, but there isn't really, as Hollie might want to reflect on, a structure that supports that and really reflects that within the CBD in the same way as the UNFCCC. And there are a lot of shared, as we say, aligning the action agendas could be a a really positive way of maybe bringing some of these conventions closer together as well. I've got lots of thoughts on that, but I'll pause.
I think Georgina's covered most of what I would have said. I agree.
Sorry.
No, you've saved me a job. I agree entirely with that. So I guess I'll just add that there is space to continue those conversations outside of the COPs themselves, like regional climate weeks, like London Climate Action Week, which is coming up rapidly. There's not the same sort of appetite currently for the other conventions, but I think if those regional climate weeks, or if we would have regional biodiversity weeks, regional land degradation weeks, something like that that gives stakeholders more power, more places to meet that don't require them to necessarily all fly to one place in the world, but to have those conversations regionally and build up support there, and then maybe send a few representatives to the next COP. That could be a way of maintaining those relationships that are built on the fringes of COPs and keeping that momentum going throughout the year to use in the next COP.
And I think I was just going to riff off what Hollie said as well. I think it is also worth saying that the private sector is further ahead on some of this synergies conversation than the structural processes themselves as well. That the narrative around kind of nature and climate action and the sort of solutions that are being developed in the private sector are a lot further along actually than maybe the international convention space.
I think what Hollie said in terms of going regional makes a lot of sense. I went to my first CBD COP in Cali in Colombia and was actually quite shocked at the circus that happens when all the world of the people who are there go there to market their science and to look for funding and to talk to people in finance. And it can be quite disheartening. Lots of good things happened there. We had a wonderful ocean day where we spent highlighting the good things and the challenges that come out. But I think what Hollie said in terms of going regional and going national and going local makes a lot more sense to me. I'm going to give you two examples why. One is when I've worked my background's in ecosystem-based management, and we struggle to get all the sectors to buy in. In the North Sea, getting the fishers involved, very straightforward. Getting the conservationists involved, quite straightforward. Getting the renewables reasonably involved, oil and gas reasonably involved. Shipping wouldn't go near us. Tourism wouldn't go near us. However hard you work with them, tourism is going to be a huge impactor in the Arctic. We've somehow got to make sure that they are at the table as a stakeholder. The other thing is when you get to some of these COPs, the smaller countries, as you know, can't afford to send people. And then you end up, I've been at pre-COPs for the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction in New York, and you get economists and lawyers who are in their national missions in New York giving the input in terms of biodiversity and the marine issues, and that's very, very difficult. So yes, go local, go regional. Makes a lot more sense. Thank you, Hollie.
Thanks so much for the really interesting panel. I work in data, and I wanted to talk about, a lot of stuff was about fragmentation and the need to kind of synchronize and align across the 3 Rio conventions. And I was wondering if you have any opinions on what kind of role data can play in kind of overcoming the need for synergies, and what kind of data gaps are currently limiting the kind of conversations across those 3 conventions.
Super interesting question. Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah. In biodiversity, and particularly in ecosystem-based management, it is evidence-based, and that's crucial, but we mustn't assume that the evidence is the solution to the management challenges. And the evidence base needs to be broader than just data as well. It needs to be a pluralistic, that's a word I can't say, collection of knowledge sources, obviously with local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge being brought there. And in the world of risk assessments, it has to be not only the quantitative numbers, but the qualitative, the experiential information that comes together. And in the marine world, we're beginning to realize that. And working with IOC in Paris and some of the other big data hubs, such as GBIF and OBIS and others coming together, we're beginning to acknowledge that everything has to be much broader than just data numbers. It's about knowledge management and making knowledge available. And the good news is under the BBNJ agreement, we've got this thing coming in called the clearinghouse mechanism. And it's not going to be one giant, huge database, and it's not going to be reworking the notion of supplying data to a place and they look after it custodian-wise. They're going to take a model quite more similar to in the European EMODNet, which is the European marine data system, where things are fed through the nodes. So the clearinghouse mechanism and the approach is to data and knowledge, and would that data be quantitative and qualitative, and do it through a nodes-based approach with hierarchical tiers.
Anyone else wants to add something? If not, I can definitely add something on this. I think, I mean, we could have had a whole event on data, right? Because there is problem around reporting, so different people wanting to capture the same thing with different data. We have problem around data accessibility. We have problem around biases and geographies places where we don't have the data. So in terms of alignment, what is being discussed a lot is the problem of trying to capture the same entity but using different data, depending on which convention you're looking at, as well as having some form of agreement on how to measure things, typically biodiversity, especially when you're dealing with a multi-dimensional concept. Data accessibility, data agreement on metrics, is all this definitely plays a role in alignment, which is why in the report we talk a lot about scientific consensus and having more platform for those scientific community that support different conventions to talk more together, because those communities are also fragmented, which means that they each have their own idea about what data we need and how to measure things. And if they don't come together, you continue to have fragmentation in those arenas, which means integrated target monitoring and setting becomes really tricky, if that helps. Anyone else wants to add on this?
No, I think that summarizes it really well.
I know there's a question here, and I'm so sorry I missed it before. Hello.
It's okay. Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm thinking a bit with a sort of my government role hat on at the moment, but and this actually follows on really from the question before, which was about London, the regional climate weeks and stuff, and thinking about London Climate Action Week. It's not a deliberate regional thing, but I suppose that's what it's termed. But we're talking about this issue with national action and progress. I mean, there's so much talk about nature in the discussions at London Climate Action Week, but it's not that explicit, I guess, certainly in the title. So I suppose I'm just thinking of, is there anything we can do to kind of, just thinking about a mechanism for, a kind of national synergies discussion, getting government more engaged in it, because the thrust is naturally it's quite civil society focused, it's very business focused. Being in London, there's huge amounts on finance, for example. So but the energy there is huge. But can we think of a way? This is a coffee conversation, but to kind of make that more synergies focused and more national, like UK rather than just London. But that's kind of a model that if you think about what we were talking about, the energy that you can get from these meetings and the follow-up, what you could do around that may be something we can think about to trying to really help move things forward at national level. Just one thing, but maybe some thinking on that.
Who wants to go?
Yeah, very open to ideas. And hello, Noel. Really open to suggestions. I mean, I'm all up for a rebrand. Call it UK Nature and Climate Week. It's all good. I think something that feels a bit more. If there was something that we could do that draws the attention. I think these moments of attention and concentration do stay with people, and there are positive things that come out of them as well. And something at a more national level with local level engagement and action is always, useful and helpful. I don't have any ideas off the top of my head, but I'm very happy to chat about it afterwards as well. Like how could we get a UK-wide Nature and Climate Action Week? What would that look like in terms of local action leading up to the national level? How do we come behind that? And how to get government more involved in that. I think there's always a little bit of a hesitation or a reluctance to kind of come out there and run things from a government perspective, but there's so many useful conversations, shared conversations and roles that they can play. So yeah, I don't have anything off the top of my head just yet, but I think it's a useful thought.
I might build up on this question, if that's all right, because
Yeah,
I think we have paid a lot of attention to the international context and the silo, but obviously we have the same within the UK, right?
Yeah.
So DESNES take care of energy, DEFRA takes care of biodiversity, and so we don't really have those connections either. And admittedly, there's been a lot of movements through the land use framework, which is trying to address those trade-off and compromise and discussion. And we are having the national recovery strategies, which help to have regional discussion to try to bring those agendas together. But I would ask the three of you, given your domain and your interest, what do you think we particularly need to do domestically? Where are those silos and which one are particularly worrying you? And now I'd like to have the three of them, but Mark.
I sit on a committee with Nathalie, so she's heard this before from me. To start with, it would be nice to have terrestrial biodiversity and marine biodiversity dealt with in the same way 100%. In the UK. You would be really surprised as an island nation how basically marine biodiversity is stuck in a corner over there. Yeah. And we have I heard recently at a meeting that we were having, I asked why the UK Marine Strategy, which is a legacy of the European Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which has huge levels of monitoring and assessment of state across 11 descriptors, so that's eutrophication, biodiversity, food web dynamics, fisheries. I mean, it's a very, very complicated setup. None of that under the UK Marine Strategy comes under the Environmental Improvement Plan. And I asked why, and they said, well, to start with, the UK Marine Strategy is UK-wide, and the Environmental Improvement Plan is only for England, therefore we can't include it. So that's the level of silo that we have. We have problems with the devolved situation, challenges with the devolved situation. I like the devolved situation, but it does result in challenges. And we have, in my world, the frustration of the marine world being completely siloed from the terrestrial.
Hollie, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'm going to go with planning frameworks on this one, because that's something that I've sort of personally worked on before. And particularly when I was going through the draft of the new National Planning Policy Framework earlier in the year, there were some updates to that, which I thought, yeah, great, this is sort of moving us towards a more integrated approach, like focusing houses being built potentially around railway stations, which I was like, okay, great, this is bringing in transport and connectivity into potentially low carbon transport into the housing. That makes sense. But there was other places where it felt like there was completely missed opportunities. There was a whole big section at the back of it about building data centers and the energy requirements for data centers, and very little about the siting of data centers with water accessibility and water availability, which when you consider that we're, especially in the south, we're in an incredibly water-stressed region, and at one point in time, the Environment Agency is desperately trying to figure out how they're going to get enough water to the houses that we already have, including coming up with some very interesting potential scenarios that I'm not going to go into here. So that's what the Environment Agency is working on there. Meanwhile, other people are trying to build houses, which we desperately need. And then there's also this, the building of the data centers to generate more income. And I don't know if these three are talking to each other, and they really, really need to be. So the fragmentation within the planning system that, even I've seen as sort of a casual observer is what concerns me. And that's what I'd like to see more coordination from.
Georgina, last thought before I close the session?
Yeah, lots of thoughts really. I think I completely agree on the marine points that were made, 100%. The way that is not, and also the bit in between in terms of the UK has a huge coastal area and immense pressures on our coastal ecosystems. That's something we work on a lot at ZSL as well, and that quite often globally as well. It's not necessarily a forgotten area, but it's one of the areas of increasing pressure, whether it's port development, it's infrastructure, it's the way that renewable infrastructure comes on from the marine environment, comes onto land, for example. I think that quite often is an area that's forgotten, and something we talk about a lot is a seascape approach, and thinking about that as an integrated system from land through to the sea, the river systems that are connected. And it speaks a lot to what Nathalie was saying about that integrated ecosystem approach as well. I think maybe we've overcomplicated things a little bit, and we over-engineer every single little thing, and every single thing has its own process and policy and way of working, but actually we sometimes forget to step back and look at the bigger picture, and I think it'd be good if we did that slightly more as well.
I'm going to have a huge sign that I need to stop this session. So I'm going to very much thank Georgina, Mark, and Hollie for their presentation, and thanking you all for participating in the Q&A and coming here today. Thank you very much. Our next event will be on the 23rd of June, looking at why storytelling matters for conservation. If you check the event page on the ZSL website, you'll get all the information needed on the upcoming event. Thank you very much again for coming, and good night, everyone.